In 1816, a volcano erupted on the other side of the world, and the sky above Europe and North America turned pale for an entire summer. Crops failed. Temperatures dropped. People called it the year without a summer. That part is well documented, widely taught, and broadly accepted. Here is what is less discussed. Within the decade that followed, roughly 1820 to 1850, more than 200 monumental clock towers were constructed across cities that had no telegraphs, no shared architectural journals widely distributed in translation, no coordinated urban planning bodies, and in many cases, no reliable postal systems connecting them to one another. Philadelphia, Manchester, Mumbai, Istanbul, Melbourne. The towers went up on nearly every continent, in cultures with entirely different building traditions, administrative systems, and spiritual frameworks. They went up at roughly the same time, and they were built to last centuries. That is the starting point of this documentary. Before going further, it is worth being direct about what this film is and what it is not. This is not an argument for any particular conclusion. It is an examination of a specific historical pattern, the synchronized emergence of large-scale public clock infrastructure across disconnected civilizations in the first half of the 19th century. The evidence presented here is drawn from public historical records, architectural surveys, and municipal archives. Where interpretation is required, multiple perspectives are presented. The goal is clarity, not certainty. Now, back to the towers. The official explanation for this period of construction is straightforward, and it is not wrong. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating. Factory systems demanded punctuality. Workers needed a shared reference point for time. The public clock tower was a practical solution to a coordination problem created by mass industrial labor. Scholars have documented this connection extensively, and the logic is sound. When people need to be somewhere at a specific hour, you give them a visible clock. That explanation accounts for Manchester. It accounts for Birmingham. It accounts for the mill towns of New England where factory bells and clock towers emerged together as a single industrial ecosystem. It is a clean, rational story. And then you look at Lahore. In 1847, a clock tower was completed in what is now Pakistan, the Guntagar of Lahore. At the time, Lahore was a city in the final years of the Sikh Empire, transitioning toward British colonial administration. The tower was large, visible, and built to a technical standard that would have required skilled craftsmen, imported materials, and significant administrative coordination. The industrial coordination explanation applies here in a modified form. Colonial timekeeping served imperial logistics. That is a reasonable reading. But the tower in Nakuru, Kenya presents a different challenge. And the one in Colombo. And the structures in regional cities across South America that weren't factory towns, weren't imperial logistics hubs, and weren't, by any documented record, part of a coordinated infrastructure program. The pattern is not that clock towers were built. Clock towers had existed for centuries in Europe. The medieval campanile tradition goes back to the 12th century. The pattern is that they were built everywhere in a compressed window of time to a similar scale, with similar technical ambition, during a period when global communication was slow enough that the coordination required to explain simultaneous construction simply didn't exist in any documented form. Historians who have examined this period note something they tend to describe as a convergence of civic ambition. The phrase is useful. It captures the idea that multiple cultures independently arrived at the same solution to the same problem at the same moment. Convergent evolution is real. It happens in biology, in language, in technology. Wheels were invented in multiple places. Writing systems emerged independently. The clock tower, under this framework, is simply another example of humans solving the same problem the same way. The convergence explanation is compelling until you examine the specificity of the towers themselves. Because it is not just that they built towers with clocks. It is the scale, the permanence, the engineering investment. Many of these structures were built to a standard that vastly exceeded what was functionally required for basic timekeeping. A clock face 20 feet in diameter can be read from several blocks away. A clock face 40 feet in diameter, mounted on a tower visible from 2 miles, serves a different function. or reflects a different intention. And across this 30-year window, it is the larger, more permanent, more over-engineered version that appears repeatedly, in city after city, culture after culture. In Kolkata, the Shahid Minar, modified and repurposed across administrations, stood as a vertical marker in a city that already had sophisticated timekeeping traditions of its own. In Edinburgh, the Balmoral Clock Tower was designed to run 2 minutes fast, deliberately so travelers wouldn't miss their trains. A practical quirk embedded in a monumental structure. In Melbourne, Flinders Street Station's clock infrastructure was built before the city's train network had reached anything close to the scale that would justify it. That last detail matters. Infrastructure built before demand is a specific kind of decision. It implies either extraordinary confidence in future growth, or a framework of planning that extends beyond immediate need. When that pattern appears in one city, it reflects local ambition. When it appears across dozens of cities on separate continents in the same decade, it starts to ask a different kind of question. The timing raises questions not about conspiracy but about coordination, and about what coordination even looked like before the systems we now take for granted existed to enable it. Because the next thing you notice when you map these towers chronologically is not just that they appeared simultaneously. It is that the administrative structures required to build and maintain them appeared simultaneously too. The municipal offices, the public works departments, the civic bodies tasked with managing shared infrastructure at a city-wide scale. In city after city, across regions with no formal diplomatic or commercial relationship, something that looks like a template seems to have been applied. Where that template came from, and whether it was transmitted, inherited, or arrived at independently, is exactly where this story becomes difficult to resolve with the sources we currently have. Start with the United States because the American case is the most thoroughly documented, and in some ways the most difficult to explain cleanly. Between 1820 and 1855, more than 60 major municipal clock towers were constructed across American cities. This number alone is not remarkable. What is remarkable is the geographic distribution. These were not clustered in the industrial Northeast, where the factory coordination argument would predict them. They appeared in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, in New Orleans, in cities that were, by the standards of the time, still frontier settlements, places without paved roads, without reliable sewage systems, without the basic civic infrastructure that typically precedes monumental construction of this kind. You build a clock tower after you build everything else. That is the conventional sequence. In city after city across antebellum America, the sequence was reversed. The Erie Canal offers a useful entry point into understanding what was happening in this period. Completed in 1825, the canal connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, a feat of engineering that, by any reasonable assessment, was premature. The economic case for it was contested at the time of construction. The population it was meant to serve hadn't yet arrived. The agricultural output it was meant to transport hadn't yet been produced. Critics called it Clinton's Ditch after Governor DeWitt Clinton, and the name was meant as mockery, a monument to ambition without justification. Within 2 decades, the canal had transformed the American interior and generated returns that far exceeded its construction cost. The ambition turned out to be correct. But the ambition preceded the evidence that would have justified it. That model, infrastructure built not for present need but for a future that planners seemed certain was coming, appears repeatedly in this period in contexts that share almost no other characteristics. In Britain, the railway expansion of the 1840s follows a similar logic. The decade is sometimes called railway mania, a period of speculative investment and rapid construction that laid down roughly 6,000 miles of track in approximately 10 years. What is less frequently discussed is the degree to which the supporting infrastructure, the stations, the switching yards, the water towers, the signal systems, was built to a standard that assumed a network far larger than the one that existed at the time of construction. Engineers designed for throughput that wouldn't materialize for 30 years. Station platforms were built long enough for trains that hadn't been designed yet. This is not unusual in infrastructure planning. Engineers routinely build for projected future demand. What is unusual is the synchronization of that forward-looking ambition across systems that had no formal relationship with one another. In the same decade that British engineers were overbuilding railway stations in Lancashire, municipal authorities in Karachi, then a modest port town only recently formalized as an administrative center, were constructing civic buildings with clock infrastructure embedded at a scale that made no immediate sense for a city of that size. The Empress Market Clock Tower, completed later in the century but planned and resourced from this earlier period, reflected an administrative imagination that seemed to be working from a template of what a city was supposed to look like, rather than what Karachi actually was at the time. The same pattern appears in Cape Town, in Montevideo, in the regional capitals of what is now Indonesia, where Dutch colonial administration installed civic clock infrastructure in cities whose populations were not yet organized around industrial timekeeping in any meaningful way. The clocks came before the need for the clocks. There is a concept in urban planning called induced demand, the idea that infrastructure doesn't just serve existing behavior, it creates new behavior. Build a road and traffic increases. Build a train line and neighborhoods develop along it. The infrastructure shapes the civilization that grows up around it, rather than simply serving the civilization that already exists. Applied to this period, induced demand offers a partial explanation. Perhaps the clock towers weren't responding to a need for public timekeeping. Perhaps they were creating the cultural expectation of public timekeeping, making visible, monumental, and permanent the idea that shared civic time was something a city possessed. That is a reasonable framework. It becomes harder to apply, though, when you examine the administrative similarity between these projects across entirely different governing systems. Because here is the detail that accumulates into something difficult to dismiss. The organizational structure required to build a large public clock tower is not trivial. You need a body with authority to allocate public land. You need a separate body with capacity to commission and manage construction. You need an ongoing administrative function responsible for maintenance and timekeeping accuracy. You need a system for funding that crosses multiple civic budget cycles. In 19th century Britain, this structure existed in the form of municipal corporations, bodies with long institutional histories and established legal frameworks. In colonial Lahore, it existed in the form of imperial administrative offices. In Cincinnati, it existed in the form of newly created city councils operating under state charters that were themselves only a few years old. Three entirely different governing traditions. Three entirely different legal and institutional frameworks. And yet the administrative choreography required to produce a monumental civic clock tower appears in all three, in the same compressed historical window, with a similarity of process that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence or independent invention. Whether this reflects inheritance from a shared administrative tradition, convergence toward a universal model of civic organization, or something else entirely, that question does not have a clean answer in the existing record. What the existing record does show is this: by 1855, the silhouette of a major city, almost anywhere in the world, had come to include a clock tower. Not universally, not without exception, but with a consistency that cuts across colonial and non-colonial contexts, industrial and pre-industrial economies, Eastern and Western architectural traditions. The clock tower had become, in a remarkably short period, the visual grammar of the modern city. And embedded in that grammar, in the scale, the permanence, the technical ambition of these structures, is a set of decisions that point toward a level of planning confidence that seems, from the outside, disproportionate to the information available to the people making those decisions. The word that keeps appearing in the architectural literature from this period, across languages and administrative traditions, is a word that translates roughly as enduring. These structures were built to last. Not for the decade. Not for the generation. For centuries. That word, enduring, eventually leads you to a name. A label that emerged not from the 19th century itself, but from a much later attempt to describe what this period seemed to represent. A name pulled from an older map. A name that, depending on how you approach it, means either everything or nothing at all. The word Tartaria appears on European maps as early as the 13th century. It was not an invented civilization. It was not a myth. It referred, in the cartographic tradition of medieval and early modern Europe, to the vast interior of the Eurasian continent, the land stretching from the Caspian Sea eastward through Central Asia and into what is now Mongolia and northern China. On maps produced by Venetian, French, and British cartographers across several centuries, Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, marked a region that European powers understood imperfectly, traded with intermittently, and feared with some consistency. It was a geographic label for a place that was real, populated, politically complex, and economically significant. By the 18th century, as European cartographic knowledge of the Eurasian interior improved, the label began to disappear from maps. The territories it had described were absorbed into more precise designations. The Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, the various khanates that European diplomacy had learned to name individually. Tartaria became an anachronism. A cartographic relic of a period when the interior of the world's largest landmass was, from the European perspective, a single enormous unknown. That is the historical origin of the word. Straightforward. Documented. Uncontested. The modern reinterpretation of Tartaria is something different, and understanding the distance between the two is essential to understanding what this conversation is actually about. Beginning roughly in the 2010s, a framework emerged, primarily through online communities, alternative history forums, and eventually mainstream social media, that repurposed the word Tartaria to describe something far more specific. In this modern reinterpretation, Tartaria is not a cartographic label for Central Asia. It is a proposed lost civilization, technologically sophisticated, architecturally prolific, and spanning a geographic range far beyond the Eurasian interior, whose existence, proponents argue, has been either forgotten or deliberately obscured in mainstream historical accounts. Within this framework, the monumental civic architecture of the 19th century, the clock towers, the grand railway stations, the domed civic buildings, the wide boulevards of cities that seem too ambitious for their documented histories, becomes evidence of Tartarian construction. Buildings too sophisticated for the populations that supposedly built them. Infrastructure too permanent for the needs it was supposedly designed to serve. A visual consistency across disconnected cultures that implies, to those operating within this framework, a single point of origin. That is the modern reinterpretation. It is important to present it accurately because it is easy to caricature, and caricature prevents genuine examination. When you look at the clock tower pattern through three distinct interpretive lenses, each one captures something real, and each one leaves something unexplained. The first lens is the conventional historical model. Industrialization created a demand for shared civic timekeeping. Colonial administration spread European architectural conventions across subject territories. Convergent civic ambition produced similar solutions in similar circumstances. The Erie Canal, the railway stations, the municipal clock towers, these are the products of a specific historical moment when Western administrative models were expanding globally and non-Western cities were either adopting or being reorganized around those models. The synchronization is real, but it is explained by the reach of empire and the logic of industrial capitalism. This model is rigorous, well-sourced, and accounts for the majority of the evidence. What it struggles with is the pre-demand problem. The towers that appeared before the populations that needed them. The infrastructure scaled for a future that wasn't yet visible in the data available to the people commissioning it. The second lens is the diffusionist model, not the Tartaria framework specifically, but the broader scholarly tradition that argues human civilization has been more globally interconnected for longer than mainstream historiography typically acknowledges. Diffusionists point to architectural similarities across pre-contact cultures, to trade routes that moved not just goods but techniques and ideas across distances that seem implausible given the transportation technology of the period. Under this lens, the clock tower synchronization is not miraculous. It is the visible result of knowledge networks that existing historical sources document incompletely. Information moved. Templates traveled. The administrative choreography that produced similar civic structures across disconnected cities reflects a web of cultural transmission that was real but is difficult to reconstruct from the surviving record. This model is academically legitimate, though contested. It requires accepting that the historical record has significant gaps, which it does, without requiring anything beyond human ingenuity and human connection to explain what those gaps contain. The third lens is the Tartaria framework itself, presented here as its proponents present it, not as its critics dismiss it. Within this framework, the 19th century was not a period of new construction. It was a period of reuse. The monumental buildings, the clock towers, the grand civic architecture, were not built by the populations that came to inhabit them. They were inherited. The civilization that built them, vast, technically sophisticated, operating across a geographic range that the word Tartaria has been repurposed to describe, was disrupted, ended, or reset by some catastrophic event, and the populations that followed moved into its structures, claimed them as their own, and eventually constructed historical narratives that explained the buildings as products of their own civic ambition. Within this framework, 1816, the year without a summer, the volcanic winter that opened this documentary, is not incidental. It is the candidate event. The disruption that ended one world and began the process of another inheriting its physical remains. This framework is not supported by the conventional evidentiary standards of academic history. It requires accepting absences in the record as evidence of removal rather than simply as absences. It asks you to read the gaps as signal rather than noise. Return, then, to the towers themselves. Standing in cities across 5 continents. Built to last centuries. Scaled beyond immediate need. Appearing in a compressed window of time that predates the communication infrastructure that would have been required to coordinate them deliberately. The towers are real. The pattern is real. The question is what the pattern means, and that question does not resolve cleanly regardless of which framework you bring to it. The conventional model explains most of the evidence and leaves the edges uncomfortable. The diffusionist model fills some of those edges with a plausible mechanism and leaves the specifics underdocumented. The Tartaria framework fills all the edges at once, at the cost of requiring a catastrophic erasure for which the physical evidence remains, at minimum, ambiguous. What all three models share is an acknowledgement that something significant happened in the first half of the 19th century, something that left its mark in stone and iron and clock faces on every continent, and that the full shape of that something has not yet been rendered with complete clarity. The towers are still standing. Most of them keep accurate time. And the questions they raise, about planning, about coordination, about what it means to build something intended to outlast everyone who built it, remain as open as the sky above a city at dusk, when the clock face catches the last light and the hands move forward, indifferent to the argument about who placed them there. The evidence invites examination. What you do with it is yours to decide.